as society developed, where was he at in the early Biden campaign?
I think during the presidency, that the people around him had him out there in the public eye too much. He was on television every day, and I think was frankly sort of overexposed. And I said much earlier, I mean, they could have done a much better job of working with Congress than they did. You know, and as you noted, I mean, by the beginning of the second term, I mean, lose, you know, Democratic control of Congress in the first midterm in 2010, which was a disastrous election presidency. And the other thing that I think is not appreciated enough is how foreign policy terms things turned out far worse than people had expected. And, you know, we look back now with the war in Ukraine, you know, at how the United States in 2014, when Russia first seized Crimea and then the Eastern Donbass, you know, that the Obama administration was too passive in objecting to those early aggressionist moves by the dictatorship.
And do you think too, in the past couple of years, that African Americans will look at Obama and say, you know what, I wanted to get into politics because of Obama, or did he have any effect?
I don't see it in racial terms, no. Indeed, when we look at the numbers of Democratic elected officials across the country, particularly at state legislative levels, Democrats lost ground to Republicans, quite significant ground, throughout the Obama years. Now, that's in part because the Obama administration didn't put much effort, much energy to supporting the Democratic National Committee, paying attention to state level politics. As you indicated a few moments ago, they were, you know, much more fixated on national press coverage of Obama himself individually. But I think that in the longer lens of history, that it's going to be the foreign policy record that draws the most criticism. You know, many people will remember how with the Syrian dictatorship using chemical weapons against its own citizens, you know, Obama had declared that, you know, using chemical weapons against civilians would be a red line and that the U.S. would do something. Then when that happened, he drew back and we didn't act. You know, we did intervene militarily in Libya, you know, not a country that most people would think of as a priority. That ended up with Muammar Gaddafi dead, but Libya has remained in Israel ever since. And then lastly, and maybe most importantly of all after Ukraine, the Obama years were slow to realize a quite profound threat that the Chinese Communist Party regime poses to the United States. And it's ironic to me as a liberal progressive Democrat, you know, that the Trump administration, for all its, you know, many shortcomings, that the Trump administration was much more perceptive in identifying and highlighting the rising threat from the Chinese communists that was true during the Obama years.
And so the legacy, is there a different legacy for the country as a whole for Obama compared to the legacy from African Americans for what they think of Obama?
I think most Black people remain immensely proud, not just of Barack, but of Michelle and the children. and what that family represented in the White House, for all Americans, Black Americans in particular. But I don't think most Black Americans feel that the Obama presidency left them better off in economic or material terms. Now, Obama alumni like to emphasize Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act. Now, again, I'm to the left of Barack in some respects, and I lived in Britain, which has a real socialized health system. So to me, the Affordable Care Act was first and foremost a sort of gift to the for-profit insurance industry.
And in your book too, which I thought was interesting, I've seen this stuff on clips. So you went to Chicago to interview some of his old girlfriends. And so his book, would you call it like, and I think a lot of politicians do that. It's like every politician has a book coming out, that they do their own narrative. And what you were doing was pretty much checking out, journalistically for you. It seems like he's making his own kind of universe in some ways.
Yeah. No, I mean, my verdict on Dreams from My Father, and I said this in print in Rising Star. I've said it in multiple interviews, that it's a work of historical fiction, and the girlfriends are a good example of that. In Barack's memoir, there is one anonymous composite girlfriend, not named. In reality, prior to Michelle, he had 3 serious girlfriends. And the brief composite in the book draws a little bit from each of them. Alex McNair, who was his first serious girlfriend in the early 1980s, when he's like 21, 22 years old, been at Occidental College with him. Genevieve Cook, an Australian woman whose father was a diplomat and an intelligence officer. Genevieve, like Barack, came from another country, went to college here in the U.S., an international child, sort of like Barack himself. They were together in New York in the mid-1980s. And then lastly, Chicago for upwards of 2 years, Sheila Yeager, half Japanese. People could speak of all 3 of these women as white, but being half Japanese does not identify as white. And they were all significant people in Barack's life. Barack was quite a letter writer. I mean, think back to the 1980s. We're not doing email in the 1980s. Right. And Barack was, with all sorts of friends. Barack would, send them postcards, traveling, and send them handwritten letters. And so as a historian, I'm fortunate. Obama may be the, last U.S. president for whom we actually have handwritten letters to go back and read.
Yeah. And tell me about the story, I guess about the letter he wrote, trying to confirm this, to one of his girlfriends where he was talking about fantasizing.
It's a November 1982 letter. I mean, keep in mind, he's, 20 years old at that time, to Alex McNair. She let me read all of his letters to her. This is during the presidency, early in the presidency. But she held back this one paragraph. She didn't want anybody to read it. She just said it's about homosexuality. But then, come 2017, Alex sold all the letters commercially. They ended up at Emory University in Atlanta. She was, I think, honestly, a little embarrassed that she'd had to sell them. She said to me there were some family, medical challenges. And Emory wouldn't let journalists, take images of the letter. And so I had one of my oldest friends, faculty member at Emory for a long time, actually go to the archives and find the missing paragraph and literally copy it down by hand, and then missing text and email. So we were able to add that language to the paperback edition of Rising Star, which came out in 2018. And I mean, some people, may think it's embarrassing, but to me, I mean, everything I've seen in life is that the vast majority of beings have fantasy lives. So I don't think it's especially newsworthy that Barack Obama, as a 21-year-old, had fantasies.
And yeah, it's interesting because I guess a couple people have been talking about that earlier this year, because I was like, okay, what is this news and why are we, kind of talking about it? Because I'm not into salacious stuff, but I'm curious because that's what everybody's talking about. So, were you pleased with your book?
Oh, very much so. I mean, it made the New York Times bestseller list. The Washington Post named it one of the 10 best books of 2017. I think it's by far the best of all my books, in part because with digitization and the web now, we're able to find things that back in the 1980s were almost impossible to do. I think back to when I was looking at African American newspapers, in their coverage of the civil rights movement. And in 1983, that meant microfilm. I mean, you're probably old enough for microfilm. I think a lot of people, anybody under the age of 30, has probably never touched a reel of microfilm.
Right.
But trying to look for black newspapers' coverage of Dr. King on microfilm was painful, literally painful. To me, reading microfilm, almost made me feel nauseous. And look, you want to research, black newspapers from decades ago. Say Joanne Robinson, the woman who really started the Montgomery bus boycott, a lady I knew very well in the late 80s. Her memoir is a best-selling University Press book, The Montgomery Bus Boycott and the Women Who Started It. And now, in these last few years, with all these small black papers digitized and available on the web, we're able to see that Mrs. Robinson, in the years before the boycott, was writing all of these things for black newspapers across Alabama. So the technology has really improved our ability to do sort of local level African American history.
And with AI now, I think, and it's kind of crazy because I've dabbled in it a little bit, and where it would take me hours to get on stuff and everything, and even on the internet, I asked AI something, and I was researching African American television shows because I'm working on I've always been fascinated with a lot of stuff, and I was curious, like, how many African American shows have been on? Okay. So, if you're doing old time research before the internet, you're really, microfiche or whatever. But then you got the internet. So then what I did, I talked to AI on my phone, and I had it break down the decades, from the 50s to 60s to whatever. And it got a lot of shows. And it took me maybe 10 minutes. We're old school, who knows how long it would have took. And it's when you have technology and just trying to use it in the right way. So, you've been a historian and journalist. How do you feel about that? Journalists, researchers today, they may not be putting in that hard work, or are they, because of technology?
I spent most of my academic life on law. And the database that law professors use called Westlaw. It has, academic articles as well as court decisions. And I realized over the years that among law professors, the first instinct is to just search in Westlaw for something, because you can do it right there on your board, as opposed to going to the library, and finding, books aren't in Westlaw. And so the existence of this magical database, almost traps people within a universe of law review articles, rather than leading them to look for books that are actually going to be, generally speaking, better researched a law review essay.
I know technology is crazy. So we have on the program Mr. David Garrow, and so I want to talk about this real quick. The piece that you put out a couple years ago dealing with the legacy of Dr. King. And as I mentioned at the top of the show, I guess you were trying to get it out there in the publications in America, and people wouldn't take it because of the length of it or because of the subject matter.
I think both. The long prehistory here. My second book, The FBI and Martin Luther King Jr., was published in 1981 because I was the first person in 1979, 1980 to use the Freedom of Information Act to get all of the FBI files, hundreds of boxes, filed on Dr. King, his advisors, his organization. And we knew, even in 1980, 1981, that the FBI had wiretapped and bugged King extensively. Now, wiretap means, phone.
Right.
Bug means a microphone, under your desk, as they were doing with Dr. King in the lounge or hotel rooms. Now, the FBI began surveilling King because it thought that Stanley, whom I mentioned somewhat earlier, this important white political advisor to King, that Levison was perhaps a communist influence. Well, he wasn't. He had once been an important communist, but he was in no way subversive in his dealings with Dr. King. But their electronic surveillance on Levison, on King's other friends, led the FBI to realize by late 1963 that King was far from monogamous, that he had all these friends. And so the FBI very consciously begins this effort to try to collect embarrassing recordings of King with women. Now, most of that material was put under federal court seal in 1977. But under the Kennedy Assassination Records Act, material that was shared with congressional committees investigating both the King and the Kennedy assassination in the 1970s, that material is available through the National Archives. And so in 2018, the National Archives put up on the web all of the new FBI material from the surveillance of King. And it's very difficult and complicated to go through. I mean, if you go to the National Archives Kennedy page, it's like hundreds and hundreds of pages of an Excel spreadsheet, and those sheets lead to PDFs. Okay. PDFs are often 500 pages long.
Oh, wow.
And they're not organized by subject. So it's extremely complicated material to figure out how to access. But in 2018, that's what I went through to see what was new in all of this, web-posted material concerning Dr. King. And so that's how my 2019 article, and it's magazine pages, as you've seen, it's a long article. It's available on my website, davidgarrow.com. And it's really an updating of my 1981 book, all across the whole story, of the FBI's pursuit of King, particularly with regard to the human informants that the FBI targeted against King, as well as the electronic surveillance.
And wasn't the FBI, I guess back then for me, I've been reading a bunch of articles. So were they trying to get him for taxes and see if he was a communist? But because they're getting this salacious information, they gotta kind of dwell more on that.
By 1964, the FBI's very explicit focus is on trying to publicly embarrass King by leaking this salacious sexual material. But American news media back in 1964 and 1965 didn't print that sort of material.
Right.
Whether it was about King, whether it was about John F. Kennedy, whether it was about members of Congress who were drunk in public, didn't get reported. I remember as a young man working in the U.S. Senate in 1972, watching a U.S. senator at about 11 o'clock in the morning hold a conversation with a marble pillar in the Russell Building. There was a famous story of a very important member of Congress ending up in the tidal pool, on the Washington Mall with a woman dancer in the middle of the night. That was what finally sort of broke the logjam, if you will, about coverage. So the FBI was very frustrated that they couldn't succeed in getting any publicity for this, sleazy sexual information that they were gathering on Dr. King. And it wasn't until, some years after Dr. King's death that any of that, began to see the light of day.
And it's interesting because I hadn't heard anything about Dr. King and, the sexual encounters, maybe to me, up until about 10 years ago, because I was one where, it's Dr. King and, the dream and everything, journalistically too. And I talked to people about this recently, especially when I told them I was interviewing you. When you find out something and it doesn't match up with what people perceive, as a journalist scholar, is it your duty or responsibility to just put out that truth?
I would complicate the question in this way, Anthony. When the government, when the National Archives releases something publicly, puts it up on the web, in the case of 2018 documents, as an honest historian or journalist, pretend that it's not there. I mean, anybody with could click on the link if they knew the right link to look for. It's out there. But back when I was doing Bearing the Cross, 1980s, I first met Dorothy Cotton, who was Dr. King's closest female friend. I first met Dorothy Cotton in 1979. And Dorothy was very happy to talk about Dr. King. But she likewise made it clear that she wanted to be thought of as his colleague in the civil rights movement, not his girlfriend. In Bearing the Cross, I did not publicly identify Dorothy. And indeed, up till the time, a decade or so ago, when Dorothy passed away, none of us who write about Dr. King did Dorothy, because Dorothy, consistently made it clear to us that she didn't want to be sort of pigeonholed as Dr. King's partner. She wanted to be acknowledged as, a movement, a significant participant, which she was. And so that to me is a very important distinction, that we have to be sensitive, be empathetic towards the private lives of people who are still with us. But once people pass away, I think the obligations of history really take precedence. And we have to be honest about the shortcomings and the emotional struggles that someone like Dr. King went through.
And
I made it clear back in Bearing the Cross that by the end of his life, Dr. King had a binge drinking problem. And we know now that problem existed years earlier too. I think it's fair to say that when one looks at the entirety of King's life, how much stress he was under, being in a public role that he didn't particularly desire and hadn't sought out. I think it gives people a much richer appreciation of how difficult it is to be a famous public person like Dr. King was.
And it's interesting now in society. It seems like you've had Clinton, you've had Cosby, R. Kelly, you've had politicians. Everybody's getting caught with something, and it seems like people in society today they're like, okay, well, they're human. So if something like this happened and King was around, and even Jesse Jackson, something like this happened, and we heard about some of our heroes that were tainted or / human, it seems like society is kind of okay with them as long as it doesn't affect them.
And similarly, I mean, John F. Kennedy in the White House accused a young female intern in a fashion, to my judgment, significantly worse than Bill Clinton and Miss Lewinsky. But somehow that's not quite entered the public understanding of John F. Kennedy to perhaps the degree that it has with former President.
And so, in closing, what's next for you?
Oh, I'm over 70 now. I'm perfectly happy to write a book review every month or so. Okay. It's much more fun to read and write about good books than books you have to criticize. I mean, all of my writings over the years, apart from my books, are all on my personal webpage, Garrow.com. I mean, that's it's very important to me, that everything I've done is easily accessible for free, to everyone who would like to look at it.
Well, I really appreciate you being on the show, and we've had on the show Mr. David Garrow, and he's written fascinating books, fascinating articles. Go to his website, check him out, and when you do certain things, are you scared of the pushback from people, or
no, never.
Okay.
I mean, a quick example: Justice Harry Blackmun, who wrote Roe v. Wade, was very nice to me when I was working on liberty and sexuality. But in 2005, I had to write an article about how, in his late years, Justice Blackmun was letting his clerks do too much of the work. Okay. They became, quite partisanized. So you've got to be willing to be critical, whether it's Dr. King, whether it's Barack Obama, whether it's a Supreme Court justice whose decisions you like. As a professional historian, you've got to deal with the entire record, not just the parts of it that you might like.
I like that. Well, so we'll end it there. So thank you again for being on the program, and you have been watching Keeping It Honest with yours truly, Anthony Parker Alexander, as we've had on the program Mr. David Garrow. Thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you.